This event occurred on a summer evening. My mother was driving, with me in the shotgun, and my twin sister and little brother in the back. We were driving to our family's cabin in western Maryland, 4 hours away from our home in Pennsylvania at the time. Cass and I were 12, and my brother was little, asleep in his booster seat. Camping in western Maryland was our favorite place on earth, so we were all very excited, including my mother. Now, the car ride, on the other hand, was always miserable. It was hot with no AC in the car, and we didn't have phones back then, so the few music stations we picked up on the radio that weren't religious gospel and idle conversation were the only things we had to entertain ourselves for those 4 hours. So, more often than not, Cass and I would stare out the window, making up stories about the people we saw and where they were going. And when we drove by truckers, we would try to get them to blow their horns, which was always very satisfying when they obliged. That's where the trouble really began. Cass and I were early bloomers, so by 12, we already looked a little older and were already getting lots of attention from older men wherever we went, much to my mother's annoyance. At the time, we were around 2 hours away from our cabin when I made eye contact with a trucker and made the motion for him to honk the horn on his semi-truck. He grinned at me and immediately obliged, which made me smile back. But he didn't stop staring and driving next to us. He had seen Cass behind me, my mother, and me, and unfortunately, he decided he liked what he saw. I didn't know what some of the gestures he was making meant until I was much older, and let's just say he was being very vulgar. When my mom noticed, she told me to keep my eyes down and not to encourage him by continuing to look. My mother attempted to slow down so he'd pass, but he slowed down with us, staying level with us. With that, my mother sped up and forced herself in front of his semi-truck. However, he moved into the slow lane and sped up to meet us again. This went back and forth. No matter what my mother did, he was there next to us. There were so few cars on the highway with us that we couldn't just disappear from him. I glanced over, and his seat was raised enough that we could see his shoulder moving up and down. Even though Cass and I had no idea what he was doing at the time, my mother did. At this point, my mother flipped off the man, and the smile continued on his face, growing wider. Now, we're getting close enough that the road turns into 2 lanes. The trucker cuts us off sharply as it does, and ends up in front of us. We're in such a secluded area now that it would be a record if we even saw 5 more cars the entire way there. The right lane is against the wall of this giant mountain, and to the left, beyond the safety railing, is a steep drop-off down the mountain. The roads are also getting more twisty as we get closer, and it's starting to get dark out. The man is going slowly now and repeatedly swerves into the left lane as my mother tries to speed past him into the wrong lane. My mother is getting angry and presses the gas hard, now with us completely in the wrong lane. He presses on the gas too, trying to match us. We're midway past his truck when he begins veering into the left lane, our lane, forcing us inches from the guardrail. Cass and I are screaming in terror at this point, unable to control ourselves. Our brother wakes up and begins crying just because we are, and my mother has a death grip on the steering wheel and has a look of panic on her face. He keeps dipping in and back, obviously enjoying the terror he's causing. My mother slams on the brakes and we swerve right, almost smashing into the wall of the mountain. We stop then, angled towards the mountain. He doesn't stop and actually keeps driving forward. I can hear nothing but my heartbeat pounding in my ears. My mother is trembling and takes a deep breath. She doesn't look at us, but my mother struggles to back up and get us angled back into the right lane. I become terrified for a moment that even after avoiding being forced off the side of the cliff, we might end up falling off backward anyway. After 3 attempts of backing up and pulling forward, we finally managed to pull back into the right lane, going no more than 30 miles per hour. I'm already prone to getting car sick, so I grab the plastic bag in my seat console and puke my guts up from fear. My mother rolls down our windows, and we drive in silence until we get to the last stop before our cabins, only about 45 minutes away. It's this little redneck gas station, but it'll do. We clean up, and I brush my teeth in the dim bathroom, and we leave, now in complete darkness. The police in that area are notoriously unhelpful, so we don't even bother. Not to mention that cell reception out there is unheard of. We drive in silence the rest of the way. When we get in that night, Cass and I try to talk about it, but my mom shuts us down. She tells us that she's used to men being creepy like that to her, and that it had nothing to do with us, snapping that there's no reason a grown man would be looking at us over her. She builds a campfire for herself and gets super stoned, making us go to bed as she calms down outside. Anyway, I'm just glad that we didn't die by being forced off the side of the mountain or even smashing into the side of the mountain that evening. Even though very few cars ever drove in that area, we were also lucky someone didn't whip around one of the curves and smash into us while we were in the wrong lane. To this day, Cass and I have major anxiety driving, and even just being next to semi-trucks sets us both into an overwhelming panic attack. After that evening, no matter how boring the trip to or from was, you can be sure that we never attempted to get truckers to honk at us again. I used to be an OTR truck driver who drove with another guy. This job only lasted a year in total, but within that year I had some strange encounters on the road. One of which was another truck driver who decided to take his shirt off at a fuel lane and proceeded to wash himself with windshield wiper fluid during one of my breaks. Despite encountering weird and off-kilter people, there was one guy who creeped me out more than anyone else. He's one of the main reasons I stopped driving in the first place. The interaction happened at night. We were driving a load down to California, set to arrive the next day at night. I had arrived at a rest area in Arkansas at about 3:30 a.m., just having finished my drive time and getting set to take my 10-hour break. It was dark, with light rain pouring, and the rest area in particular was located a bit down from the highway and completely encircled by trees. It was a perfect spooky atmosphere for the interaction I was about to have. I clocked out for the night, quickly scanned around, and hopped out of the truck, locking it. The rest area was pretty quiet, with a few sparse cars in the parking lot and a couple of semis that had decided to sleep there for the night. There were benches scattered around with some canopies over them to shield from the rain. As I was walking to the restroom to take a leak, I noticed a man in the dark smoking a cigarette and sitting on one of the benches. Walking past him, my anxiety raised a bit, but not enough to set off alarm bells. I decided to keep heading to the restroom. After handling my business, washing my hands, I headed back to the truck. The man was still seated in his original spot, but his body language told me he was now watching me. His face was shrouded in shadow due to the overhead light, but his whole body turned as I walked past. Feeling slightly paranoid, I picked up the pace back to the truck, hopped inside, and quickly locked the door. Thinking that the worst of my anxiety was over, I decided to turn the radio back on to finish one of the comedy shows I was listening to and eat the beef jerky I had bought earlier. As I raised the jerky up to my mouth, my peripheral vision sensed some movement, and I looked up at the benches for that man. He was no longer sitting there. Instead, he was perched underneath the light post about 10 feet from my truck. My anxiety flooded back, and I sensed that something was off. Something about his posture bothered me, and I could sense that this man didn't have good intentions. I shut the radio off and stared back. The guy didn't move at all, and the shadows covered most of his face, but I could tell he was staring at me. This stare down felt like it lasted for 10 minutes straight, and he didn't even lift his arm to take a drag from his cigarette, which was still lit. Feeling that the situation was too strange, I called out to my co-driver who was sleeping in the cab. What, dude?" he said, still waking up. "Hey man, I finished my shift, but there's also this dude staring at me in the truck outside." I heard him move about and peek through the cab curtain. "What dude?" I looked back and the guy was gone. I freaked out and scanned all over, and when I looked in the driver's side mirror, the man was now walking slowly towards the back of the truck, cigarette in his mouth. "Looks like he's walking around the truck," I said. "Really? What side is he on?" my co-driver said, confused. At this point, the guy had circled the back of the truck and was now walking up the passenger side. "He's on the passenger side now," I said. I slid over to the passenger side, grabbed my knife off the dashboard just in case. My co-driver finally saw him walking up in the passenger side mirror. The guy stopped right by the passenger door and started peering into the lower window of the passenger door. For those who don't know, semis tend to have a window on the lower part of the passenger door so you can see if any cars are in your blind spot on that side. Feeling considerably freaked out, I yelled out, "What the fuck do you want, asshole?" Which made the man leap back and step on his tiptoes to try and peer into the higher window. Now he could see me looking at him. He appeared to be in his 50s or 60s, a skinny-ish man with bright blue bugged-out eyes, and had a deranged look on his face, a mix of confusion and malice. My co-driver said, "Can we help you?" Upon hearing that there were two of us in the truck, the man abruptly straightened up and walked off, leaving both of us as confused as ever. My co-driver threw on his clothes and sat in the driver's seat. I recalled my experience with the guy up to that point, and we just sat and watched him. We noticed that every single time a new vehicle arrived, he would walk to the nearest light post and stand there. We sat for about 30 minutes debating whether we should call the police since this guy didn't actually do anything besides acting like a creep. When we finally decided to make the call, we watched the man check his phone, shake his hands in frustration, and then sprint back to one of the cars in the parking lot, peeling off into the night. That was the last time I ever saw him. What confuses me the most is what his intentions were. I was quite bigger than he was, so if it came down to an altercation, it's likely that he'd only have the upper hand if he had a weapon. If he had plans to steal the truck, we have logs and GPS coordinates on our truck at all times, and our systems alert our fleet manager if we're driving off when we have no time on our clocks. Plus, what the fuck was this guy doing out at 3:30 a.m. in a shady rest area? My best theory is that rest areas aren't watched very often by the police, and this one happened to be out of view due to the tree coverage between the rest area and the highway. It seems like this guy picked this spot for that particular reason. As for what plans he had afterward, abduction, theft, violence, I'm not clear. This night occurred about 7 years ago on my way home from my parents. I was 22, young, naive, and well, dumb. I had just moved into my first apartment. I was the first of my family to move away from our sleepy old train town that I grew up in. So I went home every Sunday to visit with the family, but mostly to do laundry and eat Sunday dinner. I lived about 45 minutes up the highway, so I generally headed home by 6. On this night in particular, there was a summer thunderstorm that had been pouring down rain relentlessly all day long. My cousins dropped in just as I was packing up to leave after dinner, so I ended up sticking around for a few more hours to visit. I left my mom's around 10 p.m. in the pouring rain, and this was the first time after moving from home that I encountered something behind him because I'm a little flustered. For the record, my headlights were on, so if he had been paying attention, he should have been able to see me. Honestly, with the heavy rain and low visibility, who knows? So I'm behind this guy as we cross the tracks and begin to climb this steep hill. Despite it turning into 2 lanes on the hill, he's driving right up the middle of the 2 lanes. Figured he didn't realize it was 2 lanes, so I just putter along behind him, keeping my distance. As soon as he reaches the peak of the hill and the road begins to level out, he moves over to the right lane. Yes, finally. So I move over and begin to pass him. As soon as I get past the front of the truck, he swerves behind me quite abruptly and begins flashing his high beams at me. Usually when someone flashes their lights behind you in our area anyway, that means turn on your lights. But mine were already on. I checked as soon as he started flashing at me. Weirded out, I put my blinker on and safely changed lanes to get out of his way. He follows my lane change and begins laying on his horn. The honking startled me, and I began to get a lot more flustered. What the hell did this guy want? I moved out of his way. My headlights are on. So why didn't I just speed up and zip away? You may be asking. Well, I grew up in this area. It had been raining heavily all day long, and I know that the service road floods a little in heavy rain, both on the shoulders and in random spots in the middle of the lanes. It's a small Midwestern town. Our roads are shitty. I had already skidded and nearly wrecked once, so I wasn't about to floor it on this bumpy service road that floods and risk wrecking again. There is nothing between that quarry and the highway, about 4 or 5 miles of wooded area. If I wrecked, it would have been just him and me. So this went on for the next 5 miles to the highway. He began tailgating me in addition to the high beams and honking. Once the tailgating begins, I'm in tears. I don't know what this guy wants from me. I'm trying to stay out of his way and get home safely. That's all I wanted. I changed lanes 2 more times, making 3 total. He followed me from lane to lane. As we approached the highway, I floored it. He couldn't accelerate quickly enough to keep up, and I lost him. Finally. As soon as I realize I've lost him and I'm safe on the highway, I just lost it. I was a hysterical wreck. There's only one exit after getting on the highway to stop in the small town the highway runs through. After that, it's all wooded for a good 30 minutes. I thought about getting off at that exit just to calm down and pull it together, but I just wanted to go home, so I sped right past it. I should have stopped. Once the city was no longer visible in my rearview mirror, I was much more calm. I managed to scramble my cell out of my purse and put it in my lap just in case. The rain led up to a drizzle the further I went. I was still pretty on edge. There weren't many other cars on the highway, and the majority of them were truckers. I'm cruising along in the center lane when the truck next to me in the passing lane begins blaring the horn and moves into my lane, forcing me over to the third lane. He continued moving over, nearly forcing me off the highway. I sped up and changed lanes right in front of him so that I'm back in the center lane. Slow down, so I'm in line with the front cab. I double-click the home button on my phone, camera shortcut, and roll down my window. Start taking pictures of the cabbie. I think the flashes made him realize what I was doing, and he began slowing down until he was behind me again. I got a lot of pictures. I sped up and lost sight of him behind me. I was satisfied I managed to get pics, but I'm just so angry at this point. I pull over onto the shoulder of the highway and wait for him. I just wanted to get behind him so I could get a pic of the license plate and report this asshole. Sadly, he was onto me, for sure. I noticed headlights behind me, a long way back but behind me nonetheless, on the shoulder of the highway. I waited, keeping an eye on the truckers passing me by just to be sure I didn't miss him. I noticed a shadow pass through the headlights of the truck, which spooked me quite a bit. Did he get out of the cab? I didn't stick around to find out. I just took off and got home as quickly as possible. The pictures were a total failure. It was still drizzling. The flash combined with the drizzle just resulted in washing out the pictures. I could see the red cab, but no matter what filters I used, there was no making out exactly what the cab said.